Your viewing of the veterans is made possible due to the proud and heartfelt support of the Power Workers Union.
All Canadians can take pride in the outstanding achievements of our Canadian Armed Forces. For 200 years, in campaign after campaign, they have represented the very best of our great country. They are famous for their bravery, their determination, their compassion. And most important, they represent a military tradition that is all about selflessly advancing the highest Canadian values: freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. That's the big picture, but our history can also be told one veteran at a time. For every warrior has their story, and that's why I'm so excited about this series. We have a unique opportunity to hear the personal stories of courage from men and women who freely answer duty's call. I congratulate the makers of this series on our veterans and those who supported them financially. They have preserved voices that deserve to be heard. They will be an inspiration for us all, now and forever.
Hello, I'm Senator Pamela Wallin. This documentary series is about war. Different wars, different times, different places, different generations, but always the same story. A story of young men and women, their bravery, their willingness to risk it all, to defend their country and the values that define it. We, in a sense, as a nation, have come of age on their backs. Because of their efforts, because of their bravery, because of their sacrifice, we have found a place at the international table of nations, and we have now a powerful voice. The veterans will not always be with us, so this is their chance to tell us our own story and our own history in their own words. Unvarnished truth. Sometimes the pictures won't be pretty, but this is the story of a nation that has fought for its future. We owe these veterans a debt of gratitude for everything that they have done for us. So now, here is the story of Canada's Veteran Force.
Hello, I'm Daniel Roderick, and welcome to the Veterans for a look at Canada's military past through the eyes of those who were there. In this episode, we're going to look at the service career of Major General Alain Forand. He's going to describe the challenges that faced Canada and the Canadian soldiers in the role of peacekeeper. And now, here's Major General Alain Forand on peacekeeping here on the Veterans.
It's a little strange, actually. I was about 24 when I enrolled. By then, I had tried out just about every trade, and I held my jobs for 5-6 months at a time, and I would quit when they became boring. I had gone to do the tobacco run in Ontario, and on my way home, I stopped in Stratford and got a job as a waiter. But after about 5 or 6 months of working there, I was starting to find that boring. So I went to London, which is not all that far from Stratford, and I happened to pass in front of a recruiting center. So I said to myself, okay, why don't I try this out? So I went in and passed the tests and promptly forgot about this. After a few weeks, I got a phone call and the guy said, we would like to send you for pilot training. Okay, I had only thought that I would enroll as a soldier or as aircrew, so they sent me to DCIEM in Toronto to pass some health exams, and that's where they found out that they couldn't take me in as a pilot because I had some inner ear problems. I would have been more likely to crash the plane than fly
J'aurais
it.
été plus en mesure de crasher l'avion que de la voler. Alors,
So I forgot about it, and after a month I left my job in Stratford and went back to Farnham where my mom lived. And as there was an opening at the police department, I became a policeman.
devenu policier. Et puis, à peu près 6 mois
And about 6 months after I became a police officer, I received a letter from the Canadian Armed Forces that said, "If you're still interested, we would like to enroll you as an officer cadet in the Army."
officier cadet dans l'armée.
So I went to Montreal, signed the papers, and found myself in Chilliwack, and that's how I began my career as an officer.
C'est là que j'ai commencé ma carrière d'officier. J'ai fait ma phase 1.
I completed Phase 1 in Chilliwack, Phases 2 and 3 in Borden, and then I was commissioned, went on my jumper course, and then I was transferred to the 2nd Battalion, Royal 22nd Regiment.
Transféré au 2e bataillon du Royal 22e Régiment, que j'ai rejoint. Et
6
puis
months
là,
after joining the unit, I was sent to Cyprus with the regiment from October to March 1969. So that's how my career as an officer with the Royal 22nd Regiment started.
la carrière d'officier au Royal 22e Régiment a débuté. Ouais, je pense que le plus grand honneur qu'on peut
I think that the greatest honor we can bestow on a former serving officer of the Vandus is to name him as the honorary colonel of the Royal 22nd Regiment.
tirer en juillet 2000.
I retired in July 2000 from the forces after 33 years of service, and I was invited in June of last year to become the colonel of the Royal 22nd Regiment.
Et puis quand on regarde mes prédécesseurs,
Now, when we think about my predecessors, such as Generals Vanier, Bernatchez, Allard, Belzile, Liston, Barry, Turcot, these are some of my predecessors who were colonel of the regiment. So you can see how this can be the greatest honor that can be bestowed upon a general who served with the Royal 22nd Regiment to be invited to become the colonel of the regiment. So to me, that has to be the pinnacle of my career.
bon, ma carrière, comme j'ai mentionné, a débuté au 2e bataillon.
As I mentioned earlier, my career started with the 2nd Battalion, Royal 22nd Regiment. 6 months later, I went to Cyprus with General Belzile, who was the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion at the time from October 1969 to April 1970.
Octobre 69.
When I came back from there, I was sent to Germany for 3 years, and when I returned home from Germany, I served with the 1st Commando from 1972 to 1975.
Pendant qu'on était là, on s'est entraîné après la guerre du...
While I was there, we were training following the Yom Kippur War, and the Airborne Regiment was supposed to be sent to the Middle East, but this was not passed by the Security Council, so to compensate, we were sent off to Cyprus, which was supposed to be a problem-free deployment. But while we were there was the coup against Makarios by Nikos Samson, and then there was the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974.
de ship en 74. Alors, le régiment Réauporté, on était...
Now, we were only an element of the Airborne Regiment, the 1st Commando and some other members of the regiment at that time, so when the war erupted, we did not have the weapons platforms that we needed to accomplish our mission.
Mais nous, on n'avait pas les armes requises pour pouvoir accomplir notre...
We were stranded between the two sides in the conflict, and so we had some events in which we had some casualties and wounded because of this situation.
situation-là. Et puis, il est arrivé une occasion, moi j'étais commandant du peloton de reconnaissance. Et puis,
And then there was an occasion while I was commanding the reconnaissance platoon, and the only vehicles that we had were some Jeeps that offered no protection at all. And so we asked the British to give us some reinforcements, so they sent us a kind of a ferret car which offered a certain amount of protection. And I would ride with them to try and identify where the firefights were and give my commanding officer some kind of intelligence on what we observed on the ground.
une idée au colonel de ce qu'on pouvait voir dans le terrain. Et puis, à un moment donné, j'ai reçu un appel.
And at one point I received a call from one of our camps, a small observation post called Crownberg, where we had a company of commandos, and it was located between the Turkish and Greek positions.
Les Grecs. Et puis, il y avait de...
Now, the Turks had conducted an attack that morning to try and take a Greek position, which was right next to our camp. Things went badly when some mortar rounds were launched, and some of them hit the OP. We had a small infirmary that caught fire, and when the guys tried to put out the fire, they were being shot at. So they were asking me, along with my two ferret cars, to go there and give them a bit of cover so that they could be able to snuff out the fire. But by the time we got there, the infirmary had burned to the ground.
L'infirmerie avait passé au feu. Alors, pour aller tourner dans les...
So for me to get through this very small camp, I had to get to the other end where there was the Peacekeeping River. And when I got there, I could see some commandos who were running back and forth. And I asked them what had happened, and it appeared that the Turks who had attacked had been pushed back, and some of them sought refuge within the lines of the United Nations camp.
Nations Unies. Alors là, ils se sont fait dire, vous ne pouvez pas rester ici, c'est un terrain neutre. Alors on va...
Now, they were told that they couldn't stay there as it was neutral ground, but they said, we're not leaving if we're not escorted out. So Captain Blacquière and Corporal Plouffe volunteered to escort them to bring them back to their side of the line. But when they started crossing the Peacekeeping River, which is just a shallow stream about 15 or 20 feet wide, with hardly any water in it at all, they were targeted by the Greek positions. So about 7 or 8 Turks were killed, and Captain Blacquière was wounded, having been shot in the hip.
Il avait été blessé, il avait été tiré dans la hanche. Le soldat Plouffe...
And Plouffe was trying his best to protect him. When I arrived, I was informed on the situation, so I said, we have to do something. We have to retrieve the officer and the corporal. So I told the driver of my ferret car to go place the vehicle in a certain spot. Then I told the soldiers, you guys put up a 50 cal and I'll go get the captain and the corporal.
Moi, je vais aller chercher le capitaine puis le caporal.
If I order you to shoot because they're shooting at me, just shoot back. So once the elements were put into place, which took about 4 or 5 minutes, I went into the river and the Greek troops started firing on my position, so I gave the order to return fire. I was able to retrieve Captain Blacquière, pulling him toward the bank, and passed him on to some of the boys. Then I went back for Corporal Plouffe. In the meantime, Corporal Plouffe, who had also been shot at while he protected Captain Blacquière while I was organizing the positions, well, one of the bullets had hit his helmet and penetrated his cheek, and he had the bullet in his mouth.
Dans sa bouche. Puis quand je suis arrivé en bas pour le chercher, il me met ça, puis...
So when I got back down there to retrieve him, he spits out the bullet and we start laughing because it was pretty funny. Okay, it wasn't really funny, but we found it funny at the time. So I bring Plouffe back and we evacuated him and the captain to the hospital. So that's what happened.
Tout au long, il y a une fois, on avait été envoyé pour protéger l'aéroport de Nicosie.
And there were other events all the way through. One time we were sent to protect the airport in Nicosia because the Turks accused the United Nations, who controlled the airport, of letting the Greeks enter the country from that location, so they were going to attack the facility. So I was deployed along with my reconnaissance platoon and some other commandos to protect the airport because the Turks were going to attack the following morning at 5 a.m. But in the end, they never attacked because negotiations were held at a very high level and the problem was resolved. And this was my experience in Cyprus. We were supposed to be there for 6 months, but we ended up staying for 10, coming home only in December.
On est revenu au mois de décembre. Après mon stage au régiment Réauporté...
When I finished my posting with the Airborne Regiment, I came back to Valcartier for about 6 months at the Combat Arms School.
Après, j'ai été nommé aide-de-camp du commandant de l'armée.
Then I was named aide-de-camp to the commander of the army, followed by a return to Germany once I had completed a 6-month course at the staff school in Kingston.
Après l'Allemagne, je suis allé à Toronto sur notre...
After Germany, I went to Toronto on the year-long staff college course, and this was followed by another year in Gagetown as the chief instructor at the infantry school.
Mon bataillon, le 3e bataillon du Royal 22e Régiment.
Then I commanded my own battalion, the 3rd Battalion, Royal 22nd Regiment in Valcartier. Following that, I was hired as directing staff on the staff course in Kingston, which I did for 3 years. I then returned to Saint-Hubert as the officer responsible for army training for a year, and then I was promoted to colonel and posted to Ottawa, where I was responsible for land force operations.
Affecté dans les opérations à Ottawa.
After a year and a half, I was posted for a year in the Western Sahara, where there was a United Nations mission, and I was the senior liaison officer with the rebel group, the Polisario.
Le groupe rebelle, le Polisario. Alors j'ai passé.
So I spent the year with them. They had been waging war against Morocco since the 80s, and we were there to try to hold a referendum to find out to whom the Western Sahara belonged. So there were 150,000 Moroccan troops, and the country had constructed a wall that separated the Western Sahara, 2/3 controlled by Morocco and 1/3 controlled by the Polisario. Now, this wasn't the Wall of China, but its mirror image over 2,000 kilometers across the desert with barbed wire and mines. The Polisario counted about 7,000 soldiers who would attack the Moroccan forces and cause all kinds of trouble. So we were there to calm things down and try our best to bring about the conditions that would lead to a referendum. This was in 1991-92, and the referendum still hasn't been held to this day. And the United Nations? are still there.
Lorsque je suis revenu, on m'a réaffecté.
When I came back to Canada, I was posted once again to Ottawa, where I was responsible for all the material holdings of the Army. Then I was promoted Brigadier General and commanded 5 Brigade in Valcartier from 1993 to 1995. And during that period, we were in the former Yugoslavia, in Croatia, and in Bosnia, and so I oversaw the training of about 5,000 troops that were deployed from Valcartier during that period.
Ils sont déployés durant cette période-là. Lorsque j'ai fini de commander ici en 95, on m'a affecté.
When I completed my command in 1995, I was sent as commander of Sector South in Croatia. And about 2.5 months after I arrived, the Croatian forces attacked in order to take back the area known as the Krajines.
Pour reprendre la partie de ce qu'ils appelaient les Krajines.
At that time, I was commanding the southern section of the Krajines, and they wanted to take back the area, which they did. And during that time, I was in a camp known as Knin, which was the capital of the Krajines.
Des Krajina dans le temps.
I took in about 1,200 Serbians who were being threatened, but the Croats wanted me to hand over 83 so-called criminals that they said they had identified. And I told them to bring me the proof of the matter, and so we ended up in a Mexican standoff for about 3.5 weeks, until they came forward with proof. And so 14 persons were given to the Red Cross to be sent to the Croatian prisons, since sufficient proof against them had been demonstrated by the Croatians.
Dans les prisons croates lorsqu'ils ont eu suffisamment de preuves. Pendant ce temps-là, bon.
During that time, we had to take care of the refugees while the Croats would cut our power and our water, and they would shoot over the camp just to harass the population, which was mostly elderly folks, women and children. And we could say that we had a small problem because my camp was able to accommodate about 300 persons. But when the trouble started, about 3,000 bombs were lobbed over Knin, where we were located, in the space of about 36 hours. So I took in all of the United Nations workers in my camp, along with my 1,200 refugees. So at one point we were about 2,100 people in a camp that should have held only about 300. So breakfast would start at 7 a.m. and would finish around noon. And we would start dinner around 3 p.m. to finish around 8 p.m. You could say it was a bit dicey for a while. So that was pretty much my experience in Croatia. When I returned to Canada, I was named Chief of Staff for the Armed Forces, so I was basically controlling the operations for the Armed Forces in Ottawa. I did that for about 7 months, then I was promoted Major General and given the command of Land Force Quebec area in Montreal. And barely a week after I was in the position, there was the Saguenay flood to contend with, for which we had to react quickly. Then in 1998, we had the famous ice storm, during which I commanded about 12,000 troops, both military and civilian, in Montreal and throughout the Montérégie area. And in many ways, this was like a balm for all of us, because I'm not sure if you remember the 90s, when the reputation of the Army was, let's say, not so good because of Somalia, which I am of the opinion that the event was blown up out of all proportion. So this event helped the population to realize how essential the forces can be, as we arrived in Montreal over 36 hours before the Quebec government asked us to intervene, because being in Montreal, I could analyze the situation differently from the way they were studying the question here in Quebec City. They were not affected by the ice storm, everything was fine, and they could not comprehend the number of problems that were beginning to surface in Montreal and in the Montérégie region. So I brought in troops more than 36 hours before they had been requested officially, and we were under the impression that when the military arrived, the population was able to calm down because we were everywhere, and the troops are really appreciated because the people were proud and happy to see them, and so we felt appreciated afterward. As far as the public was concerned, there were 3 polls conducted during the operation, in which the population was asked which was the best organization on the ground. And all 3 times the Army had about 95.5% of the popular vote as the best organization, followed by Hydro-Quebec with 81%. So as far as feeling appreciated went, well, it was fantastic. So my career was winding down as I had reached 55 years of age, and I was supposed to retire after my posting as commander of Land Force Quebec area in 1998. But I was asked to take a 2-year career extension because the famous Y2K bug was coming up. So I was asked to form a national contingency planning group that was to conduct an evaluation of the state of preparedness of the federal government and of the national infrastructure. Now, national infrastructure is 90% owned by private enterprise and the provinces, and the federal government only controls 10% of it. So I formed this group that was composed of about 50 military personnel and about 40 civilian employees with a deputy minister responsible. Of course, this was a bit of an emotional time because this was really the first time that the military was working intimately with civilian elements. But I feel that we did a very good job, as there was no problem and there had been tons of preparation. And in the end, I completed my report, and in July of 2000, after 33 years of service, I said, "Thank you very much, but it's time for me to go."
Je quitte. Un an après, j'ai quitté les forces.
A year after leaving the forces, I was invited to be the Colonel Commandant of the Infantry, which is an honorary title representing the 28 Infantry Regiments of Canada. I accepted the offer and stayed in the position for 3 years.
Tant que j'étais là, je suis...
Now, while I was serving in that capacity, I was asked to join the board of Hydro-Quebec, where I stayed for 4 years. And at the same time, I was the honorary colonel of the 4th Intelligence Company. And when I finished my mandate as Colonel Commandant of the Infantry, I became the honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the 4th Battalion, Royal 22nd Regiment, where I remained until recently when I took on the role of honorary colonel of the Royal 22nd Regiment. So that, in a nutshell, is my military career.
C'est à peu près ça ma carrière militaire. Moi, ce que je trouve un peu...
What I find a bit sad is that when the former Yugoslavia was spoken of, the only places we heard about were Bosnia and Sarajevo because of what happened. We never talked about what happened in Croatia, where Canadian battalions had served since 1992, where the ground was extremely difficult to negotiate, where we worked with other United Nations organizations who did not have the same training or levels or skills that we did. And so we were always working with individuals from other countries that were there to carry out the same duties as us, but who didn't perform at the same level of expertise. So from the start, this created inequity. It created problems. There was a black market that was already in place, put together by a certain country that didn't pay its soldiers all that well, and so the soldiers, to make a little extra money, would sell fuel to the Serbians. But since they wore a blue beret, all of the United Nations contingents were accused of selling contraband.
De faire de la contrebande. Il y avait énormément à l'intérieur.
Well, the Croatians did not cooperate very well with the United Nations because they did not see the need to have the United Nations stand between them and the Krajinas, which were under Serbo-Croatian control. So their level of cooperation wasn't all that good, and all of the battalions in my sector, I controlled Sector South, and there was Sector North, and there was Sector East, so all of the United Nations units were within the territory of the Krajinas. Therefore, our relations with the Croatians were extremely difficult.
L'intérieur du territoire Krajina. Alors, les relations qu'on avait avec les Croates étaient
Within the Krajinas, there were a lot of hijackings because you have to understand that within the United Nations, and even though I was responsible for an area of 2,000 kilometers, which contained the southern Krajinas, I had no control over the United Nations military police who would come and go as they pleased.
Militaires des Nations Unies. Qui, eux, allaient et venaient à leur aise.
And I had no control whatsoever over the United Nations military observers, who also came and went on their own. I was responsible for their security while having no control at all over them. There was a United Nations civilian administration group over whom I had no control, and who also were here and there, and I was also responsible for their security. It's very difficult to have all of the responsibility without the possibility of having any control over any of these people. We would try to pass on the information, but the boundaries of the military observers did not correspond to mine. So we would be informed that there was a convoy on its way from point A to point B, but since the observer's area of responsibility ended at a specific location, we had no idea where the convoy was headed afterward because it was no longer his responsibility. The military police, the United Nations civilian police, had 4x4s that were in heavy demand. Well, we would tell them to always travel in groups of 2, to always carry their weapons, to never leave their vehicle unattended because their vehicles would get stolen or hijacked if they didn't follow those simple rules. I ended up having to threaten a United Nations civilian police officer who had 2 vehicles stolen, and I told his boss that I didn't want him in my sector anymore and to send him home. And the situation was only resolved when I threatened to throw him in jail if they didn't get him out of there. So you can imagine that relations were not particularly friendly.
Quand j'allais négocier,
when I went to negotiate because I wanted to modify the areas of responsibility, because I had 4 battalions, I had a Kenyan battalion who simply didn't pull its weight, and they were the ones who had the black market scheme. I had a Jordanian battalion, a battalion from the Czech Republic, and a Canadian battalion.
La République tchèque, puis un bataillon canadien.
Basically, the only unit that I could really count on was the Canadian battalion.
C'était le bataillon canadien. Il y avait une zone de...
There was a buffer zone that had been created between the Croatians and the Krajines, and we were supposed to patrol that buffer zone to make sure there were no new mine emplacements or new positions. And there weren't too many units conducting those patrols except for the Canadian battalion.
Ça, sauf le bataillon canadien. Puis quand j'allais négocier, étant donné que...
So again, when I would go to negotiate, they knew that I didn't have all that many resources, that I didn't have much military firepower, and they knew also what my mandate was, which was to try and establish conditions of peace that would give some room for the politicians to come to a certain level of understanding.
Ben, puis souvent qu'autrement...
Well, more often than not, when I went to negotiate on the Serbo-Croatian side, they would have some brigade commanders who were pretty independent from the folks who controlled things in Kanin. And if I would arrive around 10 o'clock in the morning, well, they were already somewhat inebriated, so our negotiations wouldn't get very far.
Les négociations, là, ça avançait pas grand-chose. Puis quand j'allais du côté croate, c'était plus...
And when I went on the Croatian side, things were more formal, but I could see that I could negotiate until I was blue in the face. But all they ever told me was that they would think about it. So my requests didn't get very far.
Ça avançait pas à grand-chose. On s'attendait, nous...
On our side of things, we were convinced that eventually, on the Croatian side, they would take up arms as they had done in Sector West, where in May of '95 they had recaptured that sector. And so what happened there was that the United Nations, instead of staying put, had cut and run, and there had been some massacres.
C'était enfui, puis il y avait eu des massacres. Puis moi, j'avais donné l'ordre...
So I had given orders to all of the United Nations military forces who were under my command that we would stay put, and that we would upgrade the level of protection on our observation posts, and that there was no way we would cut and run if ever the invasion came.
Si jamais l'attaque venait. Puis l'attaque a eu lieu au mois d'août.
When the Croats invaded in August at 5 o'clock in the morning and over the following 36 hours, in Kanin, where I was located, over 3,000 shells were shot into our area.
Surtout que ça a commencé, l'artillerie a commencé à tomber.
As soon as the artillery started dropping on us, I sent a note to the Croatian commander, General Gotorina, telling him, "You are shelling indiscriminately on civilians. I'm instructing you to stop this, and I will inform the United Nations on your actions."
Des Nations Unies, ce que vous faites là. Ils ont continué à tirer.
So they continued to shell us anyway. 2 years ago at the Hague Tribunal, I testified against General Gotovina and General Chernak, who became the military governor of Kanin afterward.
Lorsque ça a cessé,
when the troubles ended, we were unable to leave the camp for 2 days, as there were armed troops and battle tanks who kept us from leaving.
de sortir du camp, j'avais...
I had 1,200 Serbs that I had welcomed to my camp, and we had to feed them and protect them for 3 weeks during the infamous Mexican standoff. But during that time, we could see fires being lit here and there, and we could hear gunfire. And when we were allowed to leave, I sent patrols in a number of places, and we could see folks who had been killed, animals that had been slaughtered, fields and houses that were burned down, and the Croatians were accusing the Chetniks, who are of Serbo-Croatian descent, that they had done this. And we were saying that that was impossible, as they had already left the area.
Ils ont tous quitté la région. Alors,
so General Chernak was the governor of Sector South. So I accused him. I sent him a number of letters that stated, "This is what we saw. Cease your action immediately."
vos actions immédiatement.
And that's why I went to testify against those two generals when I went to The Hague 2 years ago.
Comme je vous le mentionnais tantôt, j'avais...
As I said earlier, I had 4 battalions. The soldiers from the Czech Republic were excellent, but the training received by Czech officers was borrowed from their time as a country that was under the Soviet Union. And it left me with a feeling that initiative at that time, well, they weren't allowed to show initiative.
L'initiative dans leur...
So they were very good if I told them what they had to do, but the instructions had to be very precise. If the script didn't go exactly as I told them, they didn't make any decisions, and they waited for us to give them orders.
Ils attendaient qu'on leur donne des ordres. Mais les soldats comme tels étaient excellents.
But they were excellent soldiers.
J'ai jamais su réellement... Là,
as for the Jordanians, well, I never really knew if the information I was getting from them was accurate, because they didn't want to displease. Just to give an example, The Jordanians were on mission for 13 months, and the soldiers did not leave their observation post for the duration of their commitment.
Pendant 13 mois. Les officiers, eux, avaient toujours...
The officers, however, always had a backup waiting in the wings, and so they would return to Jordan every 3 months. So when I visited them, because the first thing I did when I arrived in my sector was to visit all of the observation posts, I talked to the Jordanian soldiers through an interpreter, asking them when they had gone to Canaan or elsewhere. They explained that they couldn't leave their post. So I spoke with the Jordanian colonel and said, "Look, I have some buses, so I will send them your way, and let your boys go to the beach because there were beaches on the Adriatic about 2 hours away from there."
À peu près à 1h30, 2 heures de là.
"Oh, very good," he answered. So I sent the buses, but instead of sending his soldiers, he sent his officers. So I just stopped sending buses their way. So to my eyes, they were very good soldiers because they endured a 13-month stint in an observation post. But I'm not too sure about the quality of the information I received.
Les Kenyans, moi je les appelais...
The Kenyans, well, I called them a waste of rations because, in their case, they did not have the appropriate skill sets.
Ils étaient 1300, et puis on...
They were 1,300 men, and when we were discussing reducing the number of forces at my disposal, my plan was to send the Kenyan battalion home.
Les troupes ont commencé, j'ai plus eu de nouvelles.
When the trouble started, I stopped getting any information from them. It took over 6 days before I got any news, and I found out afterward what had happened. As soon as the shooting started, they threw their bags into their trucks and waited for the Croatian forces to arrive. Well, let's just say that I wasn't too impressed by the Kenyan skill set.
La compétence des Kenyans. Mon meilleur bataillon, évidemment...
My best battalion, undoubtedly, was the Canadian battalion.
D'une certaine manière, parce que je venais de quitter...
I had, in a manner of speaking, trained them, as I had just completed my tour as the commander of 5 Brigade, and the 2nd Battalion of the Royal 22nd Regiment was part of that contingent. So I knew them very well, and I can honestly say that we can be proud of what our Canadian soldiers did, like those who were in Bosnia, and those that came before them, and those that followed. They all accomplished their duty exactly as we asked them to.
Puis dans mon quartier général, j'avais 19 pays différents qui travaillaient dans mon quartier général.
Now, I had 19 different countries that were represented in my headquarters. And there were 3 or 4 countries from which I could count on their officers to do their job because they had the skills and the capabilities.
Normal. Alors, quand il y avait une crise, c'était le bordel. Et puis...
And as we were normally in crisis mode, and when there actually was a crisis, well, it was chaos, I leaned a lot on the officers that I could count on to be able to get through the problems that we faced.
C'est que il y a bien des gens là, qui s'imaginent que le maintien de la paix, c'est...
So what I'm saying is that there are a lot of folks who imagine that peacekeeping is the highest calling. But they should understand that peacekeeping can only work if the 2 belligerents truly have the intention of maintaining the peace and are willing to work toward a final solution.
Des armées qui étaient disciplinées et contrôlées, ce qui n'était pas le cas en ex-Yougoslavie.
That they have armies that are disciplined and properly controlled, which was not the case in the former Yugoslavia, and it's my opinion that most of them were a bunch of crooks.
On a rapporté un paquet de...
Even the Croatian army, after they took control of the Krajinas, a number of murders, thefts, and looting were reported. Anyway, that wasn't exactly the way a disciplined army should behave.
Devrait se comporter. Alors, quand vous regardez ça, vous dites...
So when you look at it, well, when people are shouting peacekeeping, peacekeeping, and that some folks have elevated this to an almost mythical status, well, I can tell you with certainty that peacekeeping does not really exist. It certainly doesn't exist today when you go into a country where it's not one army against another, but a bunch of individuals who are trying to take over for their own profit, and you can't get to any kind of understanding. And their way to control the situation is to create even more chaos. So how do you expect to maintain peace? And we're being sent into those situations while the mandate is changing constantly. I think there were about 25 different mandates from the Security Council during the mission in the former Yugoslavia. How do you expect us to work properly when the mandate keeps changing and we're not getting the resources necessary to do the job?
Mandat qui change continuellement, puis qu'on vous donne pas les ressources.
The United Nations give the operational responsibility to the military, but they give the financial responsibility to a civilian organization that glories in the fact that they've performed within their budgetary envelope because they didn't allocate the required resources to you. Here's an example. When I went to the headquarters in Zagreb, I couldn't go in there during the week because the parking lot was full of civilian vehicles, some of which were 4x4s that my troops could have used to perform their duties. But the vehicles were apparently allocated to the secretaries and other headquarters staff. If you showed up there on the weekend, however, well, you had the whole parking lot to yourself, because headquarters personnel don't work on weekends. They work from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and then they go home. But for the military, well, it's a 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week commitment. So there's a kind of incompatibility, and those are problems that were explained by Mr. Brahimi, who presented an excellent report on the situation to the United Nations. But they were never solved, and it's always the same flipping problem. So when people start talking to me about United Nations peacekeeping missions, I tell them they're dreaming, because it never worked. To my knowledge, there is only one mission that went well, and that was the Namibian mission in 1989. And it only worked out well because South Africa said it will work and we will support the United Nations. All the other missions, look, we're still in Cyprus. That mission started in 1964. We're in 2010. Has it been resolved yet? Oh, they held elections recently. And now I think they're even worse off than before. They're not fighting, but there still isn't a solution. When we stay too long, we become part of the problem. They held elections in Cambodia. They cost $2 billion, and they returned almost to another type of dictatorship. Show me a place where supposedly the peacekeeping mission worked. I don't know of any except for, as I said, Namibia. So I find that Canadians are smoking dope when they start blathering about peacekeeping missions, peacekeeping missions, peacekeeping missions. The other illusion is that we imagine that we'll go there for 3 years and we'll fix the problem. Look at the First World War, 5 years. The Second World War, 5 years. Korea, about 3.5 years. But those were wars where you had a clearly defined enemy on one side and us, the good guys, on the other side. But today, to fix a problem, it may take up to 30, 40, even 50 years. There is not one country that wants to be involved for such a long time. We went to Haiti around 1995. We were there for about 3.5 years. We created an illusion of hope because we were accomplishing amazing work. But in Haiti, there's no court system, no education system, no middle class, and everything needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. So after 3.5 years, we came home and said, our job is done. I'm sorry, but if we really want to change the situation, we'd have to invest 30 to 40 years. But there's no country that really wants to be engaged for that kind of time frame. You have to be on drugs if you think that with a click of a mouse we can fix the problem within 2 or 3 years. But unfortunately, that's how people think these days. What I can see for the future, well, we say that we've evolved. In some ways, yes, we've evolved, because I think that we've never had officers who were better trained. I've been acting as a mentor at the Toronto Staff College over the last 8 years, and I participate in their exercises with majors and lieutenant colonels, and I've rarely seen such well-trained young people. In fact, they're better trained than I ever was when I went to that school. Our young NCOs can be compared to any other. I always said that the Canadian Army has the best soldiers in the world, and having seen many armies throughout my career, I can compare our officers and men to any of them. You know, Canada is known throughout the world not because of its politicians, not because of its diplomats, not even because of its businessmen. Canada is known because at one time there was a soldier who wore the word Canada on his shoulder patch and acted like a human being who was there to help people and who was sensitive to their problems, was not there to dominate them. So Canada is known throughout the world, in my opinion, through its soldiers. I've said it before, and I'll say it again today. I believe the Canadian soldier is the best soldier in the world. That's why I always tell my soldiers, when you come home from your mission, you will have done some amazing things. But you won't be able to share them generally because you're the one that lived through them, and the only folks who will be able to understand you or what you're talking about are the ones who were there with you, in the same circumstances and on the same mission. So as I've said, I'm extremely proud, and I still consider myself as a soldier. And the greatest honor that I've received is to have been named Colonel of the Royal 22nd Regiment, the best regiment. Of course, I'm speaking for myself here. And to be doing this interview here at Les Citadelles, which is the home of the Royal 22nd Regiment, and to see our soldiers who are proud to be in the military, I say that this has to be the best kind of life, and I would start it all over in a heartbeat.
And that's our look at Major General Alain Forand and peacekeeping operations in the Canadian military around the world. Remember, the best way to pay tribute to those young men and women who served this great nation is to take the time to hear the stories of what they had gone through to make this world a better place for all to live in. Thank you for joining us and watching The Veterans.